Welcome to the Danville City Commission special call meeting for today, Friday, May the 19th, 2023 at 10 o'clock a.m. That was our call to order. Let me do a few housekeeping things before we move on, though. I want to thank Mayor Pro Tem Holland for stepping in a couple of Mondays ago and doing an outstanding job of facilitating the City Commission meeting. And I want to thank my fellow commissioners for allowing her to do that and to conduct business in a very professional manner. Also, I want to say thanks to the city staff and to the citizens of Danville for your thoughts and your prayers during my brief illness. But I want to pause this morning for a moment of silence in honor of a new friend that I just got, but at the same time, a new friend that I just lost. And that is State Representative Layman Swan from Lexington, who I met in January at a new elected officials training, and he unfortunately passed away last week at the age of 47. So please, let's pause in remembrance of him as they're doing his service and his homegoing celebration today in Lexington. Thank you all. On our agenda today, we have a couple of things, but before we do the official agenda, we need to entertain a motion for executive session. So I need to ask one of my fellow commissioners if they would entertain a motion for executive session.
I'll do that, Mayor. I move that we move into executive session for litigation pursuant to KRS 618101C for specific economic proposal pursuant to KRS 618101G and for personnel pursuant to KRS 618101F. Filed by action if necessary.
Thank you, Commissioner. Is there a second?
I'll second.
Thank you, ma'am. Any questions or comments? If not, all those in favor of going into executive session say aye.
Aye.
Those opposed say nay. We're going to executive session. Thank you. in regular session. On my way in, I was making a statement about I picked the wrong meeting to return to, didn't I? So, but with that said, we had a very informative executive session. No decisions were made. We have nothing to report. So we'll move to the next item on our agenda, and that is to have a draft of the operating budget be presented by the city manager. But Ms. Lee, are you going to start us off?
He's right back.
Oh, here he comes.
I think
Okay.
he likes to start with the preface, and then I'll jump in.
All right.
No? Okay, I'll jump in then. Okay. All right.
I would like to add, Mayor, for public's sake, we did have 3 topics to discuss, so that kind of is the reason it took so long.
Yes, sir.
Other than to say this, we are not asking you for pure decisions today. We are refining the numbers and we're building towards, next week is probably our really the first thing we'd like to say is anchored, right? And so today is still that discussion where, you tell us what you're thinking, this is what we're interpreting, things you've said, okay?
So last week, we discussed capital in a kind of almost, not exactly a project-by-project basis, but we went in detail of the proposed capital items for next year. So, and based on what I thought and what Earl thought your all's feedback was last time, we have presented in this packet a 3-scenario sort of option. Scenario 1 being that we would do only items that are currently ongoing, we would wrap those up, and the minimum necessary for operations. The second item, the second option regarding capital would be what we felt as management, and based on some feedback we've had from you all already, what are some high priority items along with those necessary ongoing and operational items. And then the third option would be that if we did everything suggested and tentatively planned by the management team for the current year. So that's kind of how we've laid it out in the paper packet, in the big copy. We'll go over the slides in detail. I'm just kind of trying to explain exactly what you're seeing. But it shows that how those 3 scenarios will impact your bottom line and your fund balance in all of the funds. And to go along with that, you have a second smaller sheet of capital items and what exactly from that discussion got included within those 3 scenarios.
So each page is scenario? Is it?
Well, this is a full packet of the entire budget. We're only
Okay.
gonna hit, for the most part, but I wanted you guys to have that so you could see them all again together. But we're only really gonna hit the fund balances and the capital balances between each one. So I'll let you know what page we're
Yeah,
moving to.
take 10 seconds on the very first sheet of that packet. Is your general fund, fund summary. And so the first column, the proposed 23-24 capital operations and ongoing projects is the baseline
Okay.
and the impact to the bottom line to fund your ongoing projects with no new debt service. The second column is the, what staff recommends or what we prioritize as a recommendation that you fund, including the impact to the bottom line with only debt service for, she'll go over that. I think some of the Parks and Rec. Then on the third column is if you take everything that was on our capital program list and fund that and how you pay for it, right?
Okay.
Okay?
Gotcha.
So we're trying to present it as a shopping cart of 3 options: baseline, management recommendation, and all in,
Okay.
right? And so if you look then at your total fund balance at the bottom, that demonstrates the impact of your total bottom line with all 3 options. So if you can see that the fund balance decreases the more you fund out of those 3 columns. Does that make sense? Okay. And so the same scenario then is with this capital sheet, but you get the granular information for the capital which is the first column is your baseline, the second column is what we recommend, and the third column is, we recommend all in. Okay? So this is granular, this is your summary, and so the presentation tries to explain the two.
Okay. Yeah, it makes sense when you spoon feed it to them. I'm just a little bit.
Well, it's complicated looking, I don't disagree.
It is.
We
There's a lot
struggled
going on.
with-
It's not really after you explain.
Well, there's a lot going on with all three.
We struggled with this, how to present this, honestly, and there's probably, this is like the fifth version refinement of it, honestly.
Yeah, I think it's fine.
And then after we kind of cover the capital, we'll talk about community agency and shared agency balances. We'll come back to your all's averages and the staff recommendation. So like we said, that first page on your thick packet is your general fund summary. Scenario one, which is your ongoing projects, wrapping those up with your capital, ends up with a total capital budget from the general fund of $716,000. That pulls your fund balance down to 17.4 million. We do have in here, just for the sake of clarity, because I didn't want to add an additional item, which I think made it more clear. I don't know that that's, the option is working, but you'll see at the top of your fund balance in your resources for the general fund, because that feeds the other funds, you have some special purpose revenue that feeds in from additional spending for parks. So all that impacts your general fund. So scenario one, like we had said, is wrapping up things that are currently ongoing. And with parks, the items that are currently ongoing, that does not require additional outside funding of debt service. We would just continue to cash flow and pull down the reserves that we have planned. But there's not a good way to visually show that comparison, so they're all on the special purpose revenue line. So your second option scenario in your capital fund would be a total capital for the general fund of 1.46 million, and all in would be 1.9. The biggest changes would be an addition to add in the police department, city renovations in your in your management recommendations, and some City of Danville signs. And then your all-in would include some larger picture ideas about the utility field offices implementing some sort of homelessness initiative. That's kind of your biggest impact between those items. So, I should have pulled that on up, but that's just kind of how it's laid out budgetarily. And this is for the sake of, just a reminder for you guys from last year, compared to prior years. So that capital sheet is on page 18 of your large packet. We recategorized our capital. We were running out of true account lines to put each individual project. So we've recategorized them into accounts that relate to the type of capital. So that's why we've additionally provided this detailed breakdown, so you can see what exactly makes up those three totals. So you're tentatively spending if you select, or if you proceed with our management recommendation, about $275,000 for the police department, $100,000 for the fire department, $24,000 for communications, 911, about $960,000 for community services, and then $100,000 for miscellaneous general fund items. So that's that middle row right there.
I don't know if you'd know this, Lee, but maybe it's a Josh question. I don't understand why signs would be 210,000. I've bought signs before, even freestanding, and they're not.
We were considering the rebuild of those welcome to Danville signs.
Right.
So I threw
That was conservative? Like, I've bought freestanding signs. Oh, okay. Okay. Okay.
I will say those won't be cheap. Like, those won't be like a $2,500 sign. That's not what they'll be. I know, like some signs I've got on the front of my building when I have my store, that might be $800, right? That's not the scale, that's not what it would ultimately be for us. Typically, that's, even just a blank sign with you do the aluminum clad that we use for those applications where it's out there on right away, that there's a greater environmental impact for the sign, usually. So we get the aluminum clad. They're not cheap, the material, then you got to install it. Yeah.
That was that's the number two that, if we have a budget in mind, we can approach it with that budget, right? If it's-
Correct.
We're willing to fund $150,000, we'll strive for that, right?
Okay.
I think if you want to set that, this is kind of our kind of.
By the time you deal with the landscaping, by the time you deal with, some of them have the rock foundation. So, you're talking about spending $4,000 or $5,000 repairing some of those. Your landscaping is going to be $5,000 or $6,000 potentially. What we try to do is create a $30,000 number for each location. Seemed like a total all-in possibility, and so obviously we'd like to beat that. We'd like to
So
come
we're
in under.
redoing everything, not just the sign part.
You want to make sure they're done right, yeah.
Should look good and tongue in cheek. Let's just put wayfinding with those and won't have to deal with the state.
I don't think Latin did the same way, but we're just doing it existing.
Yeah.
So also on, as it relates to general fund, this slide right here is page 17, actually, of your packet. But this is where the larger portion that you spend, that feeds from other funds, park is the biggest. But that feeds into your top revenue section of your fund balance. But these three areas are how we get to the 17 million, the 16.6, and the 16.1 of your fund balance. So as you can see toward the bottom, you'll have a capital transfer for those other items. So I wasn't going to go, obviously ask whatever questions you guys have. I wasn't going to go into too much detail of the actual items just because we had talked a bit about them before, but I mean, that's a good question because I don't know how much a sign costs.
Yeah, and I'm
At
trying to
all.
think how I can contribute a little bit in some way to help maybe make sure it's understood. But I think it's best sometimes just to look at it for a minute and let you all think through that.
The 500,000 aquatic facility, was that just the planning?
For planning,
That would
Okay.
be planning, yeah.
Yeah.
Thank you.
And if you want, we can go ahead and skip to parks, if that would make that, because those feed together so well, I can do that really quick. Because I'll come back to municipal fund. So here is a summary of your fund balance for the Park and Recreation Fund, which will be at page,
Donna, you'll make fun of me. The first year I did this, I put no page numbers on anything. It was awful.
You're like, go through and.
well, I'm still struggling with getting the staples in the right corner, so, but you're right, Jenny, it is page 27. So this is just a snapshot of all things, revenues and expenses, operations plus capital. Capital is on that bottom line right above total appropriations. Total dollar-wise scenarios, you have baseline 2.46 million, middle of the road is 5.06 million, and then at the other end, 5.5. And I think there's an asterisk beside all of those, right, for the parks planning.
Yeah, so hold on to that sheet on the screen. Go to page 2 in this packet, at the top of it. Your granular, what I'd consider your granular one. All right, so the first column there, if you look to the total appropriations line, the line above that is capital. There's 2.465, correct? So if you go to that top page that I just asked you to go to, the first column represents your 2.465 breakdown. So you have striping and sealing, $100,000 for Millennium Park's parking lot. You have equipment of $15,000. You have, for example, Jenny Rogers site development of $500,000. You have Jenny Rogers interior renovations at $1.5 million. You have Jackson Park improvements for the grant, $250,000. And then you have an additional investment to be determined on neighborhood parks of $50,000. So then the second column, the 5065, you see an additional layer of investment in Michael Smith Park of $1 million. You have $50,000 in Bunny Davis. You have $100,000, an additional $1 million to move the fairgrounds a step farther. You have you're initializing the design services for an aquatic center. And then you're also adding $50,000 towards mountain bike trail development, right? For a total of $5,065,000. So this is how the general fund translates to this sheet. So when you go to the general fund summary, when you look at the capital, then you do it in the same way I just did for this fund. This is cleaner to compare for you. Now, I'll say this for Parks and Recreation. We are not going to necessarily initialize any capital projects. We're going to go through the next step for Parks and Recreation. So what we're proposing in the budget is mechanisms to pay for things if you ultimately choose to do that. If we get to September and you all say, you know what, we don't like anything, just stop. We can stop, right? The idea is that we go through our next workshop with the commission, with the consultant and the commission and Josh. And then we need to have a joint meeting with the county, right? City, county, this is one of the things on the list is we need to talk about that program. Then after we get through that process, once you all get comfortable with where you're at, you may then tell us, go ahead and proceed with the fairgrounds, right? So this is a way, if you wanna go ahead and fund that, this is a way to put money aside. Now, if you wanna wait on Parks and Recreation particularly and do a budget amendment, we can pull all of those non-ongoing capital out totally and wait till you get all the way through that process. This just felt a little easier, honestly, to do it with a management recommendation so that we're equipped to go forward if that's what you all choose to do. We think these are going to be the things you're going to want to do next year, which is why we put them in there. So we believe you're going to want us to proceed with, I believe we're going to get to a point where we proceed with a design for an aquatics facility next year. So therefore, we put that in the budget. Now, if you all never get there, that money's not going to be spent. Make sense? Mm-hmm. So it's easiest to explain in Parks and Recreation, but over the next few days, when y'all get away from here, if you're sitting there quietly and looking at it, this is how you look at what we've given you. Does that make sense? Yeah. And it's set up that way for every fund.
And so when it says, for instance, in Michael Smith Park for $1 million, that could be for anything?
The scope of that's still to be determined,
Okay.
really. Remember, so we know we were talking about a splash pad.
Right.
You got the entrance sign, Rotary, Josh just left to go to Rotary. They're talking about maybe they contribute some to the rock wall entrance.
Mm-hmm.
You got the splash pad and the pavilion, then you got some site work. So you could do $100,000 worth of work out there next year and stop,
Okay.
right?
I didn't know
So,
if it was earmarked.
no.
So the decision's not been made, we have the meetings and
Yeah.
we could use this money if it's already in the budget.
That's exactly right. So the year we're in, we set aside $8 million to borrow. We've
Right.
never borrowed that money because that decision never really came forward.
Okay.
You see what I mean?
Right.
So sometimes our budget looks bigger than it is because we want to build in a mechanism for you to proceed, right? We've not spent we've not borrowed that money. So now then coupled with that too, like the fairgrounds, for example, that $1 million, you can see the tennis courts being done. Everybody's been out there. We know that the rock's piled up, and we know there's some site work that we can do. There's some of that stuff we can do in the house. But then you've got the next phase is the building renovation and the baseball. So this is $1 million towards your next phase, whatever that is. Or you could use $50,000, just clean everything up and let it sit there for a year, right? So that's how we are approaching these things, is to put the decisions back in front of you in the appropriate time, but we have a mechanism to go forward if that's what you want to do. Now, go ahead and go on through, and we're going to be mindful of the time. We're not going to, we don't want to rush you, but I really feel like you're going to be well-served to just sit down with the numbers and evaluate them beyond us just talking about them for 3 hours, you know.
And I think for, Ashley will have all this in your packets as well with the slides as well. Your online packets. But this just shows how budgetarily the capital feeds into the transfers from the general fund again. But really the key decisions are what items you want to create allowances for budgetarily to move forward. And it's not to say that, you know, you won't ever be able to change that. We would just we would potentially do a budget amendment in the future. Let me skip back. I skipped municipal aid since those parks and general fund heavily rely on each other. Municipal aid is it's a small one. We didn't really do multiple recommendations because all items were really considered either ongoing and operational as in needed severely, or the largest project, which if you are on the front page of your small packet, is the Southern Connector, and that is 50% grant, potentially 50% grant funded. And typically, items that we have such a heavy outside funding source, we can make those a priority, just because down the road, you might not get that amount elsewhere. So it's kind of important to jump on those opportunities when we can. So the three big items were your Church Street extension, the Southern Connector, and the Fox Harbor extension. So your cemetery fund, we do have a couple of, just 2 items really are included in the capital items, the Bellevue Committal Shelter, which we consider kind of ongoing and as operational. So that's the only item in your first and second scenarios, and then an additional $100,000 for other upgrades to city cemeteries that are necessary. I don't know exactly what Josh.
They were included in
Yes.
the cemetery master plan that was updated. And so there was like landscaping improvements, roadway surfacing, things, miscellaneous list of improvements to do. So that's incorporated in that plan. If you want to populate, if you've not seen that, we can have Ashley try to upload that for you digitally or print a copy for you.
And this applies for fund balance of municipal aid and cemetery. Currently, we're just recommending a pull down of the fund balance, no other funding necessary from, say, the general funds. Though cemetery does get it for operations or debt service, nothing like that. Those aren't high enough values to need outside funding. Stormwater is a similar scenario. There's about all in $300,000 as a potential ask we consider about 250,000 as ongoing or necessary to maintain current operations. And staff recommend about 300,000 for stormwater improvements for Streamland, your subbasin F and G, and then potentially the subbasin S as well. Also, we don't recommend any sort of outside funding. It would be a pull down of your reserves for the stormwater. Utility fund. So there is a lot more going on with your utility fund, which is probably not unexpected. I think I'm gonna skip to the capital first and then go back to your fund balance, just because there are such big numbers. So in total, the capital is on page 55 of your packet. And then it starts on the last page of your small capital worksheet. So in total, we're recommending, as a middle ground, about 3.38 for water projects and about 6.07 million in sewer projects. In total, that would be 9.46. Your baseline is about 8.54, and then all in would be about 10, a little over 10 million. A lot of the projects out of utility fund, like Marshall talked about last time, are funded through several. A lot of these projects are ARPA funding. A lot are, we have clean water funds potential for that,
SRF money.
SRF money for some of these projects, which is why your minimum is very high compared to maybe some of the other funds, because we either already have that funding or it's very likely that we will have access to it.
The utility fund has just got so many little projects, it makes it hard, because, you know, you got to think about, you got 4 or 5 in Perryville, you got a couple in Junction City, you got several in Danville, and they're all tied to that outside money. And so it makes the list look really long. And so certainly if you want to spend time, you're welcome to let us know, and we can spend time detailing those again. Marshall tried to do that during his presentation, and we tried to demonstrate the whole list last week, and I think we gave it to you. But I know, I freely acknowledge that the, you know, we talked about this last week, the capital list looks very confusing right now because of the loose ends that the ARPA and the other funds has created for the utility, on the utility side, because there are just so many little projects that popped up.
And so this is your fund snapshot, your fund balance. That's on page, I'm going back a little bit, but
41.
41. And your main kind of items to look at in this sheet are going to be on the revenue side, your non-operating, which contains those outside funding sources. And right now, it just as a snapshot shows the same amount for each scenario. It would vary depending on how much work we actually do. And then at the very bottom, right above your total appropriations, is the capital with those lines and how that would impact your fund balance. But when you compare the items that we included in those 3 options, there are technically unfunded portions, right? Those are things that we have to do as a city, but that aren't project related necessarily, that would be ARPA funded or funded some other way. For instance, the lagoon cleanout.
Or Tower Hill is the perfect
Yeah.
example. So Tower Hill needs painted, right? Like the water tower behind Lowe's. It's time for that to be painted. The surface is failing. Can it wait 1 year? If you don't want to try to find the money, then yeah, probably we would have to wait. Ideally, it would be painted in the year we're going into.
Yeah. So I've included some what is quote unquote unfunded for that each particular item, just so you guys do have a good idea, because the outside funding skews things a bit because it includes multiple fiscal years, if that makes sense.
I noticed that we had a dump truck on the list. What y'all do with the last dump truck we gave you?
There's several down there, and we still have some 90s models that we've got to,
Yeah. I know we squeeze all we can out
yeah.
of our vehicles, I'm not worried about that.
I think there was one on the list last year, but we didn't budget quite enough. Apparently dump trucks are very expensive these days.
Yeah.
We had 50,000 and we could not find reasonable one for that amount. So we've upped it a little bit to 90. Uh-huh.
No, it has a clean water grant that is like an 80% grant, right? So it's 80% grant money. Yeah.
And I think that one's a must
Right, it's a must.
compliance
But you got
issue.
it in the current.
Yeah, so those are the ones that are either, they have to be done because they are fully necessary to continue
They have a
safe drinking
compliance
water,
deadline.
or a compliance deadline, or they already have funding.
Okay.
Yep.
So like the Kentucky 2168 water line on that is 958,000. That's total, that's a grant, 100% grant. But the lead and copper, because they implemented it, just, Marshall talks about this, and, and I feel bad because I know it's, you don't hear it every month and we live it. So sometimes we skip over reiterating things for you so you can remember them more easily. But the lead and copper is a federal requirement they're implementing. They've tried to kick in funding. Danville was fortunate enough to be one of the cities they kicked in funding to. So we got 80% of this phase one of the program funded by the federal government,
That's
right? Not by local rates.
Okay. And that's important to put out there.
Correct.
That's what I thought, but I didn't
Yes.
see anything. Okay. So I think Marshall mentioned that was, I said Marshall mentioned that was really important
Yes.
too.
Yeah.
Yes.
So that's all the capital sheets other than parking fund.
Parking is very minor. There were only two items on the list. Parking garage general maintenance that really has to be done most every year for 25,000, and then some downtown parking improvements for an additional 75. Again, we just recommend a pull down of reserves to cover either option on that.
What are you thinking there on the downtown parking?
You got a couple different options. One is the computerized marking program where, you have it, you can't chalk tires, but you can mark them with computers, theoretically. The equipment necessary to implement that was around the $50,000 number. What I'd like to do, honestly, is just continue to try to come up with that right idea that fits downtown. And I don't think that if we could figure out the fully right approach to our surface lots, to the parking garage, I think we're gonna be way further ahead, and I think a lot of folks will be satisfied. I think you've got 2 or 3 different scenarios. I think you've got some folks have lease space in the garage, some folks have daily parking in the garage, lease space here, 2-hour parking on the street. It's very complicated. And so if we can do anything, we can, if there's anything we do successful, it would be having successfully done the parking.
Yeah.
Figured that out for a change. Yep. So we wouldn't necessarily immediately begin pursuing the $50,000. We would try to look towards, is that what we need to do? What do we need to do? So, but what was interesting, and it will ultimately, I'm hesitant to recommend buying a computer because tire chalking has been sustained as a permitted thing. And only in our district, it's been said it's not. So the Supreme Court's ultimately going to say whether chalking the tire is illegal or not, right? The court that's over Kentucky, the federal system that's over Kentucky, said it is. The federal system over the West Coast said it's not. So ultimately, the Supreme Court's going to have to decide that. And when they do, I wouldn't want to be sitting here holding a $100,000 parking
Yeah,
system
right.
$50,000 parking system if it's illegal to just go out and we use chalk, you know? So we're approaching that with caution, but we do think you can fund it next year. No, we'll do that next week. We'll go towards a consensus next week. We don't necessarily need, next week, we're gonna still steer forward probably with the management unless you all, that's gonna be our baseline, probably.
Your all's recommendation?
I think so, yeah. I think the middle column is probably what we're gonna bring to you next week is the final version. I was gonna say that today, so you're asking. She asked me do we need to get a consensus, what do we do? And so ultimately, what I'm leaning towards after going through it last night and again a little bit just quickly this morning with Ms. Compton, was probably what the baseline we were gonna propose next week is that middle column. Right? When we look at the fund balance, it really pulls it down a little bit, yes, but it doesn't really pull it down enough to where, I really feel like that revenue could still come in a little higher the year we're in. So that fund balance could be 3 or 4, could make up a good chunk of that difference. So what we're thinking right now is to do the middle column. Then, once we do the middle column, we would, we're going forward with the knowledge that we're not gonna go out and break ground in something on Parks and Rec. We don't have something scaled there. We understand as staff, there's several layers of conversation left before we have the next Parks and Rec project, right?
But if we approve a budget that has the middle column, it gives us a lot of leeway
Yeah.
for new projects.
Yeah, totally does.
Yeah.
Covers a ton of ground. It really does.
Yes.
Could you clarify with, if we chose the middle choice, like Parks and Rec is 4.2 million basic, 5 million priority. Do we have enough in our general fund balance for that? Or would you have to borrow?
No, you do borrow money for parks in that second scenario.
But I think it would be targeted after you guys make some specific choices on what the projects are, right? It wouldn't be that, Josh comes with an additional layer of, just,
We don't want to go out and borrow $5 million and say, okay, now we're going to go build something.
yeah.
That is the opposite
It
of
would
what we want to do.
it would be targeted of specifically what you want. Like if you did decide you wanted to do a splash pad at Michael Smith Park, that doesn't necessarily take $1 million, and that one you wouldn't necessarily need debt service for. But if you did want to do $1 million between 3 new parks plus what we have, you might have, $3 or $4 million that you, in addition to what we already have ongoing, then we would probably have to consider that. So,
Okay, thanks.
Yeah, great questions. Is that all you all have to present?
So
One more thing.
Oh,
Go ahead.
okay, we were just gonna cover your intergovernmental agencies and community agencies, just to show where, those ended up.
I'll point for her. I was going to let her do that, but so starting with this, the first one is your airport board. When we looked at your numbers, so your numbers that you all gave us are on the bottom left, and so for them going so it looked like the majority wanted to fund some of their capital. The only problem is some of their capital, other than the setting aside $50,000 for the master plan, some of that capital was a match based on the grant amount. So it's really hard to go down below their full amount so it's either all or nothing on those lines. And so when I looked at it, it looked like that the majority of you was comfortable with the full amount. So we plugged the full amount in, and the fund balance that you see on your sheets today reflect that full amount. In terms of the EDC, we are that is fully funded based on your all's averages, and then planning and zoning also. And so that is 150 to the EDC. to fund their additional marketing they want to do, and also fully fund their staff that we are aware of now. And so now with the EDA, some of that's been confused a little bit. We will set aside, some 10 or 15, whatever the number is that we have kind of balanced. We'll propose some number to set aside for economic development initiative, which is the money that we reserve for operations of the EDA in the event it actually needs money. So we're going to take $50,000 in the budget, like we've said, that we're in now, and we're going to deposit that with the EDA by the end of the fiscal year. The fiscal year will begin the year with $100,000 in the bank, 50 from the county and 50 from the city. They may not need any money. It depends on what opportunities are presented to the EDA, or even if they have expenditures, right? But the important thing for you to understand is you don't have to budget money in this year to pursue something through the EDA. In the event something arises, that's going to be a property acquisition or some larger expense, and you may do a budget amendment to have to cover that anyway, right? And so we're not even going to try to speculate on what those are. So the budget that you have in front of you fully funds the EDC at their requested amount, and then the EDA will put $10,000 to $20,000 in the budget for what we consider economic development initiative in the event something pops up that warrants further discussion. Okay? And then the rest of the community agencies is on this sheet. And what we did here, our strategy was here, is I took what you all said, I took the average of what you all said, which is the gray column, and then I looked at the amount that they got last year, and then the requested amount this year, and I arrived at a proposed amount. This is totally my interpretation of your all's numbers, the average, last year's amount, and their requested amount. And so the bottom line is, last year we funded $144,800. This year, those numbers rolled up to $157,675. Now, I will say that we worked really hard over a number of years to get this number down to this number. And so we do have a 3-year trend where we've gone from 136, 144, now 157. But with inflation, you've added quite a bit to, for example, your senior citizen center. You've pumped 10,000 almost in that alone, right? And so you're trying to account for inflation a little bit, but I do caution you that, this is competing for the operations of the city, right? And I appreciate these agencies are operating. They do a terrific community service, but the reality is that we're dealing with city operations with the property taxes, and some of these other agencies do have other funding sources, right? And so when you all glance at the sheet, are any of them red flags that we need to visit? Now, we did have a note to talk about the full circle behavioral health, which was 3,000 versus 10, and also the greenhouse 17, which was a new request, which was 5 versus their request of 14. If you want to talk about those, certainly you need to tell us. If you don't like those two numbers, then you need to give us a little bit of advice on what to do with those.
The reason I did that was I wasn't sure this was a good time to take on any new agencies. We tried to cut back on the number we fund, but, I know they do an important workaround, so I'm not stuck to zero.
And
So
certainly,
what you have is fine with me.
the effort a long time ago was to not take on new ones, and that's just a matter of record. And so direction there is helpful for us.
And I had 0 also, because, you think of the others, are there duplicate services in the city for that same,
Right.
for the same thing?
Same enterprise.
And,
Are you talking about behavioral health?
yes,
Okay.
and not adding a new,
Greenhouse 17 is a new one as well.
it is,
But but
And they said they were splitting that with the county, or they wanted us to split
Yeah.
with the county for that.
Yeah.
I'm not sure.
and that's definitely not something that's being duplicated in our county. I
Right.
don't think that Greenhouse 17 isn't, but again, it's new. Okay, any other questions or comments about these proposals?
Yeah, I'd say, Earl, what you've done here looks good to me.
Even with
Pre-
the two additions,
Pardon me?
even with the two new ones?
Yeah.
Okay.
Unless I have some other input from my fellow commissioners. One thing that previously in the city commission, I asked Ron Scott that we might think about next year is grouping some of this stuff. Donna just alluded to it, where you have food pantry is kind of the same as another food source, blah, blah, blah. And we may just think about, in terms of city comes first function,
Right.
these departments. How much money do we want to give to entertainment or to food? And then break that down into the agencies. So if the total number's 10, you got 4 agencies, we have to decide.
Well,
That feels good to me.
it does. I don't disagree with that. Go ahead, Donna.
No, I mean, I just want to say, on my 0 for New Hope, I'm just going to clarify that, there was no information in the packet. The application was incomplete to me, and for me, I just wanted to see more of where's the money being, I understand it's food, and the surplus, and then they're buying land with cash, so I'm not sure, that wasn't explained well enough to me.
That didn't, I'm gonna verbalize this, that did not feel great for you.
Right,
Yeah.
so,
The
just
fact
more
that
of an
they had cash
explanation.
to buy land with,
Right.
right?
And I think they're not asking for funding from the county or Lincoln and other surrounding areas. She said that too,
Right.
right? And maybe with more explanation, I would change that.
You
but
could take a year off
currently-
from funding them, and they did have a cash balance. I do, seems like I do remember that, didn't they? Yeah, that's where I got that from. They did have a cash balance, so they listed a total revenue and of an expense of like 55,000. You did send that. I thought you'd sent that to everyone, but there was no detail in it whatsoever.
No, I
None.
saw that, Ashley showed that to me,
Yeah.
and there was no detail at all.
There's no detail, and so you could take a year, they did have a fund balance, a healthy fund balance, and so you could take a year off if you wanted to do that.
I'm not saying that, I just think we require our department heads to have a detailed, this is what we're spending, so it would be nice if we required of the agencies as well.
Do you all have a different feeling, or do you all want to leave it on there at 5,000?
I don't have a different feeling. My question or concern is that I thought she stated that the $50-some thousand that had been raised for the property acquisition was totally separate from the fundraising for the food pantry. I could be wrong on that, but I was thinking it was separate funding.
Well, I see, there was just none of that information really delineated, and if they do have a separate pot of money, then they theoretically should report that in their funding application.
Yeah.
Is what Donna's identifying as a flaw. Commissioner Peak, I should say.
What's her name?
So are you,
So we can leave it alone like this for a week, and you all, if you want to express an opinion specifically about it next week, we can come back and certainly dial it in. Next week, we're going to take the middle capital with the column. We'll take these numbers that are on the screen, and then what we'll do is provide you what we would consider a first draft budget, and we'll be on track to finish the budget on the original budget calendar.
okay? Any other questions or comments about this list of community agencies as well as shared agencies?
Appreciate y'all again, putting it in a format that I can almost understand.
And it might be important, right?
Budget for dummies.
It might be important also to highlight that Art Center of the Bluegrass had made a request, and that the proposed amount at this point is 0. Might be important to point that out right now. If not, are we ready for a motion to adjourn this short, brief meeting?
Staff is good with that.
All right.
Thank you for your patience today.
Thank you, Commissioner Hollow, for making that
I'll
motion.
make a motion to adjourn.
Second.
Thank you. All those in favor?
Aye.
Those opposed, with nay. Thank you all. Felt good to be back for a little.